So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work we're doing in causality at Spotify. It's going to cover like a decent range of things, some things that we've tested in the real world, tested in the app and so forth, and some of the research underpinning this and so forth. But before I dive into that, I just kind of want to ground today's kind of conversation in a kind of motivating example that hopefully, I know we're all experts, we know what causal inference is, this is why we're here. But just that really drives home, what's at stake in that, why we need to use these kind of causal methods and so forth. Or at least this is how I convinced people at Spotify to let us try do these things and so forth. So just when the COVID vaccine strategy was kind of rolling out in the UK, this strange tweet appeared on what was then Twitter. And it's showing data from the National Office of Statistics. And it seems to kind of illustrate a very strange kind of correlation here. So what we're seeing is on the top in the orange line, it's the mortality rate from those individuals, the population, who have been vaccinated against the kind of COVID. And then blue line is the people who have not been vaccinated against COVID. These are the relative mortality rates. And so what you can kind of see, which is what the kind of person was tweeting about, was, well, those who have been vaccinated somehow are dying in much higher numbers than those unvaccinated. So he's questioning whether it's the correct policy to continue the vaccine rollout and so forth. And this is correct National Office of Statistics data. So in principle seems strange. We had these randomized control trials that showed that these vaccines worked at suppressing the transmission of COVID and so forth. So what's going on here? So if we step back a bit and think about what the data generation process here for the data that was collected, and it's quite interesting in that the average unvaccinated person turned out to be much younger than the average vaccinated person, just due to the way the policy was rolled out. Those more at risk were kind of prioritized and so forth. And so age here is a confounder between both receiving a vaccination in the first place, but also for other all-cause mortality and so forth. And so what was actually going on was what we were seeing was that the benefit of the vaccine was being swamped by the correlation due to age and so forth. But when you control for age, so you bucket by different age categories, this association on the previous slide just flips back to what you'd expect given the kind of the randomized control trials that have been done. So after this was kind of realized, the National Office of Statistics took down that raw data and only put back up the bucketed ones. People wouldn't come to the wrong conclusions again and so forth. But the kind of main take home from this is that if we try and make decisions or plan actions based on correlations taken from observational data, it can have pretty disastrous consequences, such as potentially preventing the rollout of a vaccine strategy and so forth. So this is why causal inference is super important, to really understand what the question you want to ask is, and do you have the right data, the right methods? Are you framing the question correctly to get the answer to your actual question? So you might say, okay, that sounds great, but why is causal inference important at Spotify? So if we take a step back and recall the COVID example, there we had a randomized control trial. That's the gold standard for telling us if there is a causal relationship here. We can do A/B tests at Spotify, which are like the tech industry equivalent of these randomized control trials. So why do we need to do causal inference? Well, it turns out there's lots of reasons why we can't actually run A/B tests in practice. It could be, does the app crashing cause users to leave the platform? To do an actual A/B test of that, we'd have to go and force a user's app to crash, and that might have lots of unintended consequences. It might actively drive them away and so forth. So we can't really do that A/B test. Things like, does podcast consumption cause users to stay on the platform longer? It's great we have all these different content types, but really turning off a whole content type for a certain random subsection of our population base maybe wouldn't be great. It would annoy them because they had it already and so forth. So there's lots of A/B tests that we just can't technically from a feasible direction kind of do. And there's lots of other ones where actually setting up the A/B testing infrastructure is just too complex for certain problems. And so really to answer questions about causality, what would happen if we did this action today, the app, we change this product, change this model that's underpowering our recommendation technology, what would the consequence be? We need to use causal inference from the observational data that we have. Okay, so we're lucky in that there's this framework of causal inference. It's been developed by many people over the last 20 to 30 years, people in computer science, economics, epidemiology, and so forth. But Judea-Pearl has this nice way of kind of framing the types of causal questions that we can even ask in the first place. So there's 3 different types of question that kind of he formalizes as the types of causal things that we can actually answer, or at least hope to answer from certain data. The first one is just standard observation. This is where statistics, machine learning generally lives. This is just if we're in our classic example of smoking, lung cancer, there potentially being a genetic factor that underlies those. If we want to answer a question at this first layer, we'd say, okay, well, the types of questions I can answer are given somebody, I've observed them to smoke, what's the likelihood of them having cancer, let's say. So they're the types of questions I can answer there. Then the next layer is all about interventions. This is kind of where the randomized control kind of work will kind of sit. And here we want to ask a question like, what would happen if I forced somebody to not smoke? So despite there potentially being some sort of genetic predisposition that make them crave nicotine and also develop these kind of health issues, what would happen if I just reached in and forced them to smoke irregardless of those predispositions? What would the answer to that question be? So this is all about giving someone an intervention and observing the outcome of that intervention. And usually we kind of represent it using this kind of subscript here. So, you know, what's the probability someone would have cancer if I reached in and forced them to smoke, let's say. And then the final layer is what Pearl called counterfactual. So this is maybe slightly different to the way the word counterfactual is used in maybe the economic or epidemiology literature. But what Pearl had in mind here was a slightly more complicated notion. So here it's like, given the subject is a smoker and has cancer, so I'm conditioning on something observed in the real world. I now want to ask, what's the chance they wouldn't do those things had I intervened and forced them to not smoke? So by conditioning, I'm updating my knowledge about that user, about the potential maybe genetic predispositions that they might have and so forth. So the way we represent that mathematically on the bottom right-hand corner here looks maybe slightly convoluted, you know. The same variable appears twice on both sides of this conditioning symbol. So here it's conditioned on seeing cancer and smoking. What's the likelihood of cancer not being there if I had forced that user not to smoke? And there's many ways of, you know, trying to compute that kind of quantity there. The kind of standard one takes 3 steps. First is called abduction, where you look at the kind of information that you've learned from doing this conditioning. You update your knowledge about, you know, something that might be going on in that specific person. Then in that context, you reach in, you do your intervention as you would do in a randomized control trial, and then in that context, with that intervention, you then see what the outcome would be. That's the kind of standard way of doing it. But the one I'm going to focus on today, because it's very amenable to deep learning, and we'll see why later on, is called the kind of twin network way to kind of both, you know, semantically represent what's going on as well as maybe compute these kind of quantities. So if we start from our, you know, standard causal DAG, we have smoking, cancer, you know, some sort of unobserved confounder. To construct a twin network, what we do is we just copy this DAG. So we say we kind of take the DAG in the real world, we copy it across to the counterfactual world, and we duplicate arrows coming from the unobserved confounders to both. The reason for that is that these confounders are somehow outside our models, or any intervention inside our models shouldn't affect those confounders, and they're also knowledge about the kind of background characteristics that we want to hold fixed. We want the counterfactual in the real world to be as close as possible, but for some intervention in the counterfactual world. So we want to share that kind of unobserved confounder between both worlds, and now in the counterfactual one, we want to then do the intervention. We want to like reach in and change the kind of smoking variable, which I've represented by this S star and C star here. And so here, this kind of slightly complex thing where C and S appear on both sides of the conditioning symbol now makes much more kind of, you know, semantic sense, because it's C star and S star and C and S. And so answering the counterfactual question is just doing standard Bayesian inference, but on this twin network. So we're changing the causal question on the single network to this more Bayesian question on this kind of larger network and so forth. And so that's how we would answer that type of high-level counterfactual question there. And so you might say, okay, well, that all sounds great and really kind of nice, but, you know, why should we care about counterfactuals in the context of an industrial company like Spotify? And there's a few kind of different ways you could formalize this. There are many more than these, but one could be talking about promotion. So, you know, Spotify has a set of things it wants to promote to users because artists want more exposure to various content that they're producing. So you might say, okay, well, I really only want to send promoted content to users that it will really have an influence on, right? That they wouldn't find it organically themselves in the platform, so we're not spamming them and so forth. And so here you can frame that as a counterfactual question, which is, I want to find users where the joint probability of them engaging with the promoted content, if I send it to them, and them not engaging with it if I don't, is very, very high. So that's this kind of weird counterfactual thing where I want the joint distribution over 2 situations. One is which if I intervene, and one is which I don't intervene. And I kind of want them to only engage when I do intervene. And it's also, you know, content personalization. The great thing about counterfactuals is because you're conditioning on observations in the real world, you can learn something some more about that specific user than you would have otherwise. So you're conditioning and then saying counterfactual, counter to that factual evidence. what would have happened otherwise. You train your model then, and you can kind of learn something more. You can frame this as, I want to figure out, okay, if a user did engage with a certain piece of content, I want to find other content that they would also engage with had I sent that to them instead, and so forth. So there's a few different ways you can kind of say, okay, well, being able to answer these counterfactual questions will enable something interesting. At Spotify, we have this nice way of, formalizing these counterfactual questions using a twin network. And it turns out that doing this is really amenable to deep learning. So if you start with your standard DAG, you might have X being a musical track you want to send to a user, Y being whether they stream it, Z being some background characteristics of, maybe they like certain genres, maybe they love Spotify, they're on it a lot, and so forth. And you construct then the twin network from that. The twin network just enables you to answer counterfactual questions by just doing standard Bayesian inference. And so if I construct a neural network whose architecture matches the structure of your twin network, then now just doing standard inference on your neural network after it's been trained corresponds to answering these counterfactual questions. And so now I have this very, I'm putting a lot of issues under the rug here about identifiability and how do you address these things and so forth. But at a high level, this kind of process from DAG to twin network to neural network architecture gives you a sense of how we will start to answer these kind of questions. So we published this approach in Nature Machine Intelligence. Pearl, one of the kind of godfathers of causal inference, saw it. He was quite happy. He introduced twin networks in the first place, and he was like, oh, it's cool to see them being used as almost like a computational instrument in some sense. So that was kind of nice, but now let's kind of talk about, okay, we have a means to identify or to compute these counterfactuals, even when your data is super high dimensional. So your covariates, your confounders, and so forth. Because we're using this kind of neural network deep learning approach, it's able to deal with these high dimensionalities and so forth, and these high nonlinearities and everything. So now we want to actually try and apply this to a problem at Spotify. So the one we're going to choose is these promotion case. So here are the kind of different places where you can be promoted to in the Spotify app. Our treatment is, should we promote or not to a given user? We have a lot of high dimensional covariates that correspond to that user. We have a big 80-dimensional vector that corresponds to the types of things that user likes and so forth. Lots of other things like that. And so we want to figure out on a user-by-user basis, should we send this promotion or not? And so the problem is that we don't want to send a promotion to a user who would find that content organically themselves, as we kind of showed on a kind of few slides back. So we want to answer this counterfactual question here on the bottom of the screen. We want to figure out, can we reduce the amount of impressions we send out without reducing the total consumption of the things that we do send out? So if we can do that, it means that the people we don't send them to wouldn't have streamed that content anyway, and so forth. So it turns out this is like this one slide is summarizing like 18 months of work, where we built many models, experimented with them, ran some A/B tests, but we figured out that you can actually reduce the overall impressions to these promoted pieces of content by about 7% without actually reducing the total consumption of these pieces of content. So you're, in some sense, improving the user satisfaction with using the app because it's not being spammed all the time, but the content that would actually be useful to users is now still kind of getting through and so forth. So that was a kind of nice application of building a so-called conditional average treatment effect model. We got some press on this, which was nice. So MIT Tech Review ran like an article about some of this stuff, which is nice. Bill Gates even shared it on Facebook, which was a hilarious situation for me because someone I knew follows him and sent me a screenshot, and it was very fun. So it was nice to kind of see that these causal approaches have been tested in the real world in these high-dimensional, high-scale settings. So we have to do this in a very fast way so that users aren't being left with a half-rendered homepage and so forth, and that it actually drives some user value in this kind of context. But that problem was really only in the kind of binary treatment effect problem, like do we promote or not? Or it could be something like a dosage level, like how much should we send to a user and so forth. But generally the types of causal questions that we can answer in the literature are one of these two, either continuous value treatment or binary treatment, or maybe some sort of categorical treatment. But a lot of the problems that we face at Spotify are not of that form at all. They're kind of cases where your treatment object is a very high dimensional thing and you have many of them. So one example at Spotify could be, we have all these pieces of music, all these musical tracks. Each track could be thought of as a separate treatment, and we have something like a couple billion tracks on the platform. So you're not going to treat each track as a separate treatment because some tracks are correlated with other tracks, they're the same genre and so forth. So there's overlapping structure in these things, but the objects themselves are super high dimensional. The same for drug discovery. If you think of, like, let's say the molecule of that drug as a graph, lots of molecules will share similar properties, but overall we want to figure out what the treatment effect of that molecule is on a certain downstream disease. The same with, like, maybe an online marketplace where we have lots of different products. Some products are similar, some are not, but what's the impact of the product on people buying them and so forth. So how do we even answer this kind of question? Turns out that there's some subtleties in even framing this in the first place. So one nice example I like to come back to is if we kind of try and figure out what the impact of a product review is on sales of a product in some sort of online marketplace like Amazon. So there's lots of reviews there at the bottom of your Amazon screen, and you might say, okay, well, in a given review, it's the tone of the text that's really going to cause users to say, okay, well, that seems like a good product, I want to go and buy it for myself. And things like the way in which that post was written, the style and so forth, shouldn't really have an effect on whether a user buys it or not. So it's the tone, positive or negative, that really does this. But the style and the tone are kind of entangled together in that piece of text. So if the text is the treatment and downstream outcome is like you purchasing that product, how do we answer that kind of question? Because your confounders can be correlated with both the tone and the style, and the tone and the style are kind of entangled themselves. And if it's only the tone, so here in this DAG it's slightly different, that it's color coded. So only the kind of from the text to the outcome is only due to the kind of tone, but all of that is entangled together. How do we answer this question? And kind of this is a nice way to kind of frame it in some sense, or to think about these things, and that, like, ultimately if these objects, these treatment objects, are high dimensional, there's lots of latent attributes in there entangled together into that big treatment object. And some of these objects could be correlated with the outcome, but not cause it. And so things like the style could be correlated with whether a user purchases a product on an online marketplace because it's correlated with background characteristics of that user, but it may not cause it, and so we could run into issues. And so you can kind of think of this as these latent attributes we're just unaware of get now entangled together till we get this object, and if all we have is this big high-dimensional object, how do we answer these causal questions? So here's another kind of maybe nicer way to kind of observe it. The blue line here is the only one that kind of causes it, so we have what we'd say is like, causal latents and non-causal latents, and they're all entangled together in your big treatment object. Turns out that just doing the naive thing of just conditioning on your confounders and regressing your outcome onto this big kind of high-dimensional object is the wrong thing to do, because in some sense what's going on is that the non-causal latents are correlated with your confounders, and so you can seem to almost condition your confounders twice in some way here, because these non-causal latents are proxies of your confounders. And so it can look like you've control for the confounders because you're conditioning on parts of the treatment itself. But actually when you intervene on them, you realize you haven't fully controlled for the actual confounders. And due to that, you now run into issues with like standard causal inference approaches where, even if you're building a Cape model or something like this, you can run into issues where if you just plug in this high-dimensional object, you can now lead to biased outcomes, even though you're appearing to follow the kind of textbook example of causal inference, which is control for your confounders, and then what's left between the association of your treatment and your outcome is the causal object. In this case, it's not, because of this kind of high-dimensional nonlinearities and so forth. So it turns out what you have to do is you first have to learn a representation of your treatment that discards the parts of it that are correlated with the outcome but not causal of it. And once you do that, then you can do the standard causal approach where you just do this kind of backdoor adjustment and so forth. And so you might then ask, how do you do that? There's a few different approaches. One we just had published last week in Nature AI. This one I'm showing here is not in that paper, but it's kind of a work that we're doing now that we should have out in the archive soon. But the basic idea is to introduce a new type of loss function, one that has what we call a utility term, which is just, okay, what I want to do is I want to learn a representation of my treatment that is still predictive of the outcome. So here, conditioning on my confounders, holding them fixed, I want the association between what's left in my treatment object and my outcome to be as predictive as possible. But I want to somehow penalize that representation if it still retains lots of correlation with the kind of confounder and so forth. So I want to somehow throw away everything that's not needed for the kind of ability to look at the link between my treatment representation and my outcome. And you can kind of prove that actually the kind of global minima here is the one that kind of discards the most amount of the non-causal bit, and so you're going to be less kind of biased and so forth. So that's the kind of approach that paper should be on archive. maybe in the next few weeks, but the one here on the right-hand side is another approach to solving this problem using contrastive learning and that kind of work. What's cool here is I'm going to show you one more example of how we applied this approach to Spotify that we're actively running an A/B test on at the moment. So this is the kind of problem of trying to construct a playlist for a user in the first place. So lots of our playlists are personalized, they're generated for a specific user in a given context, and it just involves choosing a set of tracks and ranking them for a given user. But these tracks are high-dimensional treatment objects. You can think of them each as a kind of treatment. We want to find out which track will have the highest impact on a user's consumption and then rank them by that. And so here we have this kind of model that takes in a vector representation of a track, which is this kind of green bit in the middle here. But there's also other inputs into our kind of current track generation model, where we look at a set of larger tracks that could form the basis of this playlist, as well as what we call affinity vectors, which are just the weighted average of what a user has listened to in the last 3 months, let's say, a set of those tracks. It turns out that if you just train this model naively, like the current production model at Spotify, what it does is it just looks at the correlation between the track and what you've listened to previously, as well as what's in the pool, and then just disregards that track if you haven't listened to it before, unless it's a really new track and from a similar artist and so forth. And the reason is because the way this vector is generated in the first place is from user co-occurrence data. So we learn a representation of our tracks where the tracks are close together in the embedding space if similar users have listened to them and so forth, which means that the way that we're actually representing our treatment objects is highly correlated with user confounders, users' propensity to listen to certain genres and so forth. And so it's already a kind of failed enterprise because our treatment object is entangled with the confounders in ways that are not causal for the outcome. And so we kind of set up our approach here to try and throw away correlation between these objects that wasn't necessary. And we found that actually doing that, so maybe I'll get onto that in a second, doing that enabled the model to pay more attention to actual qualities of the track rather than users' propensities for popular or familiar tracks. So you get a bit more discovery, a bit more interest and so forth. And the reason why this kind of causal approach is useful here is that the model is only trained on playlists that a user listened to. There's lots more sets of possible playlists you can construct from a larger pool of data. And if you're just relying on familiar features and so forth, tracks that users have listened to before, you could get sucked into an echo chamber where only the same set of 20 tracks are being surfaced to you. And when you train a model to actually only pay attention to the causal things, you find other tracks that have similar attributes that will cause you to listen to them and so forth. So it generalizes better past the training data. And so that's a kind of high-level intuition for why this is useful. Here's a brief plot of the model trained with and without this kind of causal approach. You can see that we pretty much get the same on the offline data, the same predicted performance, but on the left-hand side, you see this kind of correlation between these kind of confounders and these treatment objects essentially go to zero. So it's really doing this kind of causal thing, whereas in the current model, which is this black line, it highly entangles these objects and is unable to actually separate them and disentangle them so that you can say, well, what would happen to this specific user if I changed this track but kept everything else about that user fixed? You can't do that if these two objects are entangled together. Whereas if you disentangle them, you have more chance of kind of doing this. And that's what the plot on the left-hand side is showing. You can throw away this entanglement, and now you're able to vary this track without changing bits of the user, and you should get a better kind of predictive ability. So the A/B test is going on at the moment. It's looking good so far. Reliance on familiarity and things like this are down 2-3%. Less popular tracks and less popular artists are being surfaced, so that the amount of people listening to them has gone up, which is kind of nice, but still predictability is pretty much the same. So we're kind of really showing that you can reduce this bias in this high-dimensional context of high-dimensional treatments and high-dimensional confounders without sacrificing performance, which is nice. So that's me today. Thanks very much for paying attention, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Ciarán, any questions?
Hi. With a lot of problems that you mentioned, echo chamber, I was wondering how does that compare, this causal method, how does it compare to multi-arm lenses with exploration, exploitation, recommended system, lessons. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, how does kind of biases like echo chamber or reliance on familiar pieces of content, how does the approach we took here, which is this high-dimensional treatment approach, compare to, let's say, multi-arm bandits, where you try and, let's say, randomize the set of tracks that a user might listen to in a small subset, and if you see something good, you kind of start to exploit that and kind of increase the kind of set of users who are exposed to these types of new policies, let's say. And so we're also doing that at the moment. And so this is maybe like a complementary approach where you can immediately launch it from your trained data, whereas that takes time to ramp up and try different strategies and so forth. And perhaps it's hard to hit on like a new winning track that might go viral, that it takes a lot of like experimental time. So this is maybe like a complementary approach which tries to find that faster, let's say, but we are also doing that. Yeah.
Time for another couple of questions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just want to ask about this deep twin network approach, right? Because the reason you introduced the twin networks is because you want to have a counterfactual graphical representation in one world of the performance of recommendations on user impact, right? So is there a reason why, for example, twin networks is chosen as this counterfactual representation over other graphical representations? For example, SWIGs, which Thomas isn't here, but yeah, so yeah, all that. Because I think that's quite important, right? Because in a twin network, you have this determinant relationships, which I think may mess up parameterization when you try to do deep learning approaches and all that. So is there a reason why twin networks is chosen and not other representations, for example? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the idea was, if we want to answer counterfactual questions, there are other approaches like SWIGs, single world intervention graphs and so forth, as well as the twin network approach. And then this is other like three-step approach that I overview, this abduction, action, prediction approach, which other papers had kind of formalized in a deep learning kind of context. And the basic idea was, I kind of really liked twin networks. I thought it was an idea that no one else really cared kind of much about and so forth. And so we kind of wanted to see, could you turn it into a kind of nice deep learning kind of computational instrument in a sense. You could also try the same thing with SWIGs. The issue with kind of SWIGs is the way it's graphically represented maybe isn't as amenable to just like, here is your neural network architecture, just train it using standard techniques and so forth, because you have this kind of variable splitting and so forth. And so perhaps it would be harder to just get to immediately work with deep learning. But yeah, definitely something will be interesting to explore as well.
Sure.
I just wanted to check these deep networks. I'm not familiar with them. When you first showed what you were doing with one, I thought, is that G computation?
So it's not G computation, because we're answering a counterfactual question rather than just doing kind of standard, what Perl would call like a do conditional. Whereas G computation is just some slight connection to this backdoor criterion where you condition on confounders, you have some estimand that corresponds to this G computation, but it's answering what Perl would call like an interventional question at rung 2, whereas the counterfactual is at rung 3, so it's conditioning on like observed factual information, and then counter to that factual information, want to update the parameters of your model and answer a counterfactual question for that specific user, given that evidence you have about them. So it's something slightly different, although they are, conceptually related. G computation is more related to that thing I showed on the last slide, where we have this kind of high-dimensional treatment object, and we just want to condition on these confounders and so forth, doing something else. But the counterfactual is a slightly different question.
Thank you.
Let's thank Ciarán again. That was brilliant.